Test, 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 test. خلينا نهدى بس ما تحكي لانه اوريدي يور مايك اب هلا سو شيء بتقوله تفضل. We are live streaming on Amnesia UB. So if you want to send the link to anyone, go ahead. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us today. On behalf of the History and Archaeology Department, I would like to thank all of you for your presence and thank our esteemed friend and speaker today, Professor Ara Sanjian. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to mention that this is going to be live streamed, as Professor Makram mentioned, on 50 years of amnesia AUB on our Facebook page. So if you want to send the link to your relatives, to your friends, please feel free to do so. And this talk is part of our department's ongoing activism over a year to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Lebanese Civil War. That's why we have posters on our right and left. So please feel free to download the app and continue attending our events and lectures throughout this year. So I would like to quickly and briefly introduce Professor Ara Sanjian, who is an associate professor of history and the director of the Armenian Research Center at the University of Michigan, Dearborn. He received his master's degree in history from Yerevan State University and his PhD in modern history of the Middle East from the School of Oriental and African Studies, the University of London. From 1996 until 2005, he was the chairman of the Department of Armenian Studies, History and Political Science at Haigazian University in Beirut, and he joined the University of Michigan, Dearborn in 2006. His research interests focus on the post-World War I history of Armenia, Turkey, and the Arab states of Western Asia. And he is the author of the book titled Turkey and Her Arab Neighbors, 1953 until 1958, a study in the origins and failure of the Baghdad Pact that was published in 2001, as well as 2 monographs and a number of scholarly articles and book chapters published in English, Armenian, French, and Russian. I would like to mention as well that Professor Sanjian is currently working on a political history of Armenians in Lebanon, and the talk that you are about to hear today is part of his ongoing research project. So I'm sure he would appreciate any comments and questions that will help him finalize his research. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Sanjian.
Thanks, Makram, and thanks, Barak, for the invitation. Well, I've been working on this topic for many, many years. I think it's the first time I'm talking in public on this issue. And as I said, it's part of an ongoing work, and that's why I prefer to concentrate on the pre-Civil War period, because I'm still not that confident to talk about the Civil War period in public. So just before starting, is there anybody who needs me to translate anything I was saying in Arabic? For everybody knows Arabic. Okay. Anything in Armenian, I'll translate it. That's for sure. Although there were a few kind of things that I will refer to, of course, in Arabic or Armenian. And so I will basically start with 3 snapshots from 1975, 1976, and 1979, and then I will try to build the whole talk around those 3 issues. This is the newspaper cover, front page on April the 14th on Monday. In addition to the familiar pictures of the Ain Romani bus that you will see, there is also news of a coup in Africa and the fact that the government in Egypt has submitted its resignation. But more importantly is what is at the bottom of the page for our own purposes. At the same time that unidentified gunmen were attacking Christians, protecting Pierre Jmeil inside that church in Ain Romani that will be dedicated. That was about 11 a.m. in the morning. A bunch of Armenians, a few dozen of them, were in the cemetery in Beirut, honoring the victims or the heroes or the martyrs of 1915, 1916, hanged by the Ottoman government, more specifically on Jamal Pasha's orders in Lebanon. The reason why, because just a few days later, the Armenians were getting ready to mark worldwide the 60th anniversary of the Armenian genocide. So trying to link Ottoman oppression against Armenians with Ottoman oppression against the Lebanese is a theme that Armenians in Lebanon like a lot, because it really tries to appear as if their histories are parallel. And so this was, of course, an important juncture before the actual end date of those commemorations. But what is also important in light of years of development, that the same announcement was published in all Armenian newspapers, and it came as a communique from a body which called itself Hamaskain, pan-national, which technically meant by that time that representing the three political parties plus the three Armenian religious communities in Lebanon together. That was the way it was described. And people would, of course, notice that one of the speakers on that day was a Ramgabar, and the other speaker was a Tashkent. So this, of course, was a very kind of a symbolic thing, not said, but quickly understood. And this would have probably not been possible some 20 years earlier. So in that sense, Armenians came across the challenge of the civil war at a very important moment in their own history, which was beyond their history in Lebanon per se. Things, of course, got difficult in the next few days, and the main event scheduled on the 24th of April actually was postponed. The announcement of its postponement was made in the newspapers on the 23rd of April. And then after things had got calmed down, and of course nobody knew that this would be a 15-year-old civil war then, yeah, they reset a new date very symbolically on May the 6th. So that instead of having that March and Great event on April the 24th, we would do that event on May the 6th. And actually came May the 6th. It was relatively calm. Rashid al-Sulh, the prime minister, attended the event. The next day, his government started to crumble. 6 ministers submitted their resignations on the 7th of May. By the 15th of May, he had that very famous clash with Amin Ismail in the Lebanese parliament when he submitted his resignation, a very, let's call venomous speech, yeah, and no questions taken, and then that was the beginning of the civil war. So in that sense, it came at a very kind of a particular moment. And this issue of having this kind of a unified effort going on for months, just at the time when the civil war erupted, really played an important role in how the Armenians actually confronted this new challenge. Fast forward a few months. This is the only picture I found in the family album from 1975 or 76. Probably there were not that many reasons to take photos in those 2 years. There were plenty of them before 74 and a lot after 78. And the heroes of this short encounter were myself and my mom. We were, probably this was in 1976, I don't know. We lived in Zal'a then. And essentially we were going shopping, when of course I'm accompanying my mom. And on the walls were all those pictures of, the martyrs of the various groups, of course, in Zal'a, basically the Christian groups that we were there. So with all the famous slogans, I remember, Matal Yahya Lubnan, he died so that Lebanon may live, which was the main slogan that was then. So I, of course, could read Arabic by then, and so I just read that one of those people whose death was being announced through that flyer posted on the wall was an Armenian with the name Vahe. I don't remember the surname, but I still remember the name. And when I said, look, he's Armenian and his name is Vahe. And my mom just noted, and he said, he was born in 1958. And I said, okay, what happened in 1958? And my mom said, well, times were troubled then as they are now, and the Armenians devoured one another, my son. I still remember those sentences so many years later. I've written about it, published. So this idea of Armenians devouring one another in 1958 was something that troubled not only my mom 18 years later, but probably many others in the community. And not to repeat 1958 has been such a red line for Armenians that they have observed this for 50 years. A number of years ago, I presented a paper at MESA on 1958, something which is a taboo topic in Armenian communities. And on the 50th anniversary, because I was already in America, I decided to write an article about it. And I published it in Paris, because I know that it would be very difficult to convince any Lebanese newspaper editor to publish an article like that. It was not an academic article, but it's the article that I've written which has written most responses from readers, a full box of various people writing about it because nobody actually talked about it. And then when I was presenting this paper, Robert Friedman, the famous Sovietologist, was in the audience. And he came and said, but you know, when you said that after so much bloodshed in so short a period, for many, many years, there is this idea that nothing has happened since then. And there's a very solid kind of understanding between those previously conflicting factions that needs a study in itself as well. I'm trying to do that. What changed? Yeah. So that in the last 50 years, of the many communities which try to keep a profile of their own, maybe the Armenians are the only community which have not killed one another. I'm not considering the Greek Orthodox or the Greek Catholics because essentially they don't have this aim of having a separate profile of their own. The others, all of them have, of course, fallen into that trap of killing one another and devouring one another at very different times in the last 50 years of Lebanese history. Armenians, of course, have stood up. So by 1979, almost 4 years into the conflict, that issue of Armenians remaining neutral had become so essential a way of Armenian looking at the Lebanese conflict. And here we go to Pierre Shammassian 46 years ago in an Armenian play, yeah, trying to explain supposedly to South Lebanon what the issue of Armenian neutrality is. So you may listen to him for a minute or so, and then I'll come back and start. Okay. So essentially, a lot of themes here which have to be developed when somebody writes the whole history of the Civil War, what it actually really meant. I will only try to talk a few of those things, and towards at the very end of the speech try to say some of the figures which determined how those issues should be taken into consideration. Now, we have to start with, the politics. First and foremost, I think the major change, and if we can look at these two dates very symbolically, 1958 in Lebanon marking the crescendo of inter-Armenian rivalries, and 1975 a real effort to show another face. This changes happened because of changes which basically were global to the Armenian diaspora in general, and also can be seen as part of the global Cold War in the Third World. And so that's probably a very depending thing. Within the Armenian diaspora, three political parties actually survived the destruction of the Armenian communities in the Ottoman Empire during World War I. All these parties have their roots in the Ottoman era. Even the Ramgavar party basically is an amalgamation of other of political groups which existed in the Ottoman era, or even if that official union took place in 1921, still in Istanbul, which was under British occupation at the time. So in that sense, no new political party has emerged in Armenia, in the Armenian diaspora over these years, and by and large, these parties are there in most Armenian communities. Some, of course, have a much more extensive network, like the Dashnak party, than the others, but essentially, this idea that the three of them show the Armenian establishment is a very well-established situation. Of course, when we talk about the Armenian diaspora of that period, including the Armenians in Lebanon, we should also take into consideration that there was a fourth faction of Armenian communists all across the diaspora. However, they never established a party of their own, although many of the Armenian communists in those countries where there were Armenian communities, including those in Lebanon, did have an Armenian newspaper, etc., which also covered Armenian issues as well. So by 1974-75, even their existence was taken into consideration during those efforts to form a united front. We're going to talk about them. After the mayhem of World War I and what followed in the Middle East, the situation that emerged after the Sovietization of what was formerly the Russian part of Armenia, and plus the Treaty of Lausanne, which proved to be quite durable, essentially that a situation emerged where, according to Armenian political thought, there was room for irredentism from Turkey. That was what the Armenians call Western Armenia. These were the parts of the former 6 provinces of the Ottoman Empire where Armenians lived in considerable numbers. And on this issue, basically all Armenian factions were in unison that these territories should be part of an Armenian state. Outside the borders of the Soviet Republic of Armenia, there were some areas in parts of Soviet Georgia and Soviet Azerbaijan which Armenians also thought that should be united with Soviet Armenia. Again, there was a consensus on this issue among the three political parties, but there was a clear line of division about how to deal with, in the short run, with the Soviet system in the Union Republic of Armenia within the Soviet Union. On this issue, there were divisions. The Tashnak party, of course, was vocally against the Soviet system in Armenia, while the others were ready to cooperate with it at the different levels of enthusiasm in that sense, with very diehard support among the communists into much milder support, let's say, at the other end of the structure by the Ramgavars, in general. But in a way, if we add to this the issue of balance of power, because the Tashnak party really managed to establish itself as the single most powerful party, all the others roughly coalesced with one another, either first for the purposes of having some kind of balance of power, and secondly also because at least on the major issue of Soviet Armenia, they were not calling in any way for the destruction of that regime. And why? Because this division actually quit in the sense that the non-Tashnaks in the diaspora accepted the realities of the post-Lausanne order, and overall they trusted the Armenian communist leaders in Armenia that these people had the best interests of the Armenian people at hand, and they would do what is best when the time comes. So there was this kind of a trust of the leadership in Soviet Armenia, irrespective of whether they were communist or not in the diaspora. On the other hand, the Tashnaks, of course, did not trust the leadership in Armenia and essentially took out all their own soldiers to lead the Armenian people. And while to some extent we can use a modern word that said the Ramgavars and the Hunchagians outsourced foreign policy to the government in Yerevan, yeah, essentially the Tashnaks took over to follow that. And it's very interesting in the sense that because history is a study of change, otherwise just talk about sociology, you describe it, and if nothing is changing. The history of the Armenian diaspora is also, to some extent, the history of the political choices of the Tashnak party. Because it's that party which actually gradually shifts its policy from one decade to another, and the reactions, of course, are different, etc. Not that, of course, these reactions come out of the blue, of course not. They are in reaction to what is changing in the world in general. But essentially, this is a very important way of how to look at the political history of the Armenian diaspora. I will not go into details, but come to the period immediately prior to the 1950s, before I talk about the circumstances that led to the internecine Armenian killings in Lebanon in 1958. During the last stages of World War II, the Tashnak party really made a strong shift in its policy. And this went on for something like 4 or 5 years. They expected the Soviet Union to expand after the end of the war. And this policy shift is noticeable first and foremost in America in the summer of 1943. And they expected the Soviet Union to grab parts of what were Eastern Turkey. There were reasons to believe this because the international media was full in those years of, leaks and reports that the Soviet Union wanted, especially the regions of Kars and Ardahan. These areas had been part of the Russian Imperial Empire for about 50 years, from 1877 to 1918 in that sense. And if you look at what the Soviet Union was doing in Eastern Europe, was reclaiming its borders of the Tsarist Empire, probably the same thing would happen here. So in that sense, the Tashnak party dropped this idea of an independent Armenia and started claiming to fight for what was called a united Armenia. And saying that, yes, we know that this Armenia will not be independent, but essentially, I think it's possible and we should actually support the Soviets. It's interesting that the Soviets and also the non-Tashnak parties really cold-shouldered this Tashnak change. While they initially wrote, well, I'm sure you will change your opinion. Moscow will tell you Ramgabars and Shagians to come and extend your hands to us, and this kind of articles are there. But that order never came from Moscow, and there was no that kind of a desire among the Shagians and etc. So essentially, for about 3 or 4 years, the Tashnak party essentially was trying for the expansion of Soviet territory, if you look at it from a Soviet perspective, yeah, essentially, but essentially they had no result from that. And moreover, they also saw that they were being sidelined a lot. So this was a very low moment in the party morale. And suddenly comes in a new era. In 1947, as the Tashnak party was holding its first worldwide congress after the end of the war, comes in an American POW who had actually worked with the Germans during World War II, then had been captured by the Americans. But not only him, but also his German bosses had actually made a deal with the American army and actually had started working with the Americans on the basis of anti-communism. And the offer was that, look, World War III is inevitable. It will happen. And this is written a lot at that time. It is in the nature of Bolshevism that it will create a World War III. We have to be ready. And during World War III, we can liberate Armenia from Soviet rule. This policy starts showing up gradually in 1947, but takes much more speed in 1951 and continues for exactly 8 years, 2 cycles of General Congress, in which the Tashnak start cooperating very closely with the Americans, in particular with the CIA, other than not the State Department, other institutions. And during that time, they lessened their rhetoric against Turkey, because now Turkey is an ally of their ally in NATO. Although in the internal dealings, they usually say that once Armenia is liberated, and they were okay for either an independent Armenian state or an independent Caucasian federation, both of them were acceptable to them. That area should be expanded because they said Armenians from diaspora, if they return, there's not enough land for those people to go back to their own homeland. But comes 19, and this is the situation in the lead up to the Lebanese Civil War in 1958. What is also happening with something independent is that the Soviet Union is changing with the death of Stalin. Stalin had briefly opened up to the outside world at the end of the Second World War. But this was a very short period. And then he closed the back again. And he essentially concentrated mostly on Europe. And essentially the Middle East and other areas were of no concern to Stalin in the last years of his own rule. But comes in the new administration of Nikita Khrushchev and changes the whole concept of Stalin's approach to foreign policy. The Khrushchev sees the anti-colonial movement in the Third World as a potential ally of the Soviet Union on the base of anti-imperialism, and basically starts, extending hands to everybody. Arab nationalists, and also the Armenian diaspora, and also so many others across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. So within this kind of situation, you suddenly see much more Soviet involvement in the Armenian diaspora. And this is not the topic of today, but the idea that Kremlin's expectation and Yerevan's expectations from the Armenian diaspora were not necessarily 100% the same thing. And so there was this issue as well, but we're not going to discuss that issue in general. That creates it all. The Tashnak party actually interprets this as an attempt by Yerevan to meddle into the affairs of the Armenian diaspora. And it becomes a very tense situation. And in 1951, repeating 1955, the Tashnak party takes a decision which was unprecedented. Previously, it had never done so. It takes a decision that it will ally itself with non-Armenian anti-communist forces in its struggle against pro-Soviet forces in Armenia. This again goes on for only 8 years, when it is again reversed in the early 1960s, that this is not the policy that the party should follow. So it really comes into a very kind of an explosive situation that really becomes a major issue in Lebanon when there was a vacancy in the Catholic state in Antillas. So different factions had their own preferred candidates. That result ends up in some kind of like an impasse. How the community rejects the newly elected Catholicos. And then law and order breaks down in Lebanon, and essentially you have mayhem. According to my calculations, out of the 3,000 or so victims of the Lebanese Civil War of 1958, some 40 of them, 35 to 40 of them, are the victims of Armenian to Armenian killing. There were other Armenians who were killed, but for other kind of circumstances. But I'm talking about these targeted killings within the Armenian community. The number is anything between 35 and 40. I'm just saying 40, probably just to be on the safe side. Probably it's closer to 35. And so, but it really, really shows that kind of a moment which troubled people like my mother so many years later, because my mom was a teacher and a college student at that time, when those things were happening in 1950. So this is a very important kind of, we're going to come back to this when we talk about the Lebanese Armenian community and the Lebanese Civil War again later in this presentation. By 1959, however, only a year after 1958, there is a sharp reversal in the Tashnak party policies. They come to the conclusion that what they tried was a failure. that Americans were not doing anything to make relations between Armenia and Turkey improve, that Turkey is showing no interest at all in trying to come to some kind of an agreement with the Armenians, and gradually they start shifting back to the issue of putting the issue of making demands from Turkey more of a priority than the issue of actually changing the Soviet system of government in Armenia. So that really becomes a very important moment. And as these things are happening, the Soviet government is gradually opening more and more to the Armenian diaspora, including the Armenian community in Lebanon. More concessions are being made inside the Soviet Union to the nationalisms of the various constituent republics. And things of accusing the Soviet Union to actually saying that it is against nationalism and it tries to actually to dissolve all the non-Russian kind of population. This becomes less of a convincing argument as more and more, more nationally oriented literature, culture, etc., is being published in Armenia than it was under the Stalin era. In 1961, the Armenian Communist Party actually, in its official report, for the first time mentions, the Ramgabars and Hanchagians as two factions in the Armenian diaspora with which the Soviet government can work, because they think that they're doing a positive role in the Armenian diaspora. And even more significantly, when they criticize the Tashnak party, they introduce a word there, the leaders of the Tashnak party, which creates that kind of issue that there was in the Soviet Union, that all the American people are good, yeah, but the leaders are bad, yeah. It's like today America talks about other countries. All the Afghans are good, the leaders are bad. All the Syrians are good, the leaders are bad. So that was the reverse kind of situation. But that really opens the door that a lot of rank and file Tashnaks can actually also be part of that opening up to the Armenian diaspora. And a lot of programs are initiated by the Soviet government in order to increase those links. I think personally, the most crucial one, which really generates a change, is the issue of inviting school teachers from Armenia, from the diaspora, to visit Armenia for the summer. A program which they started in the early 1960s. This opens the door for practically many Tashnak leaders to actually visit Armenia, because many of them were school teachers. Even the principal of the Armenian college in Lebanon, who was the last prime minister of the pre-Soviet independent republic, he receives a sounding that if you agree to come as a principal of your own school, we are ready to extend you an invitation. And that he says, no, that's too much. If I want, I cannot deny that I was the prime minister of a regime that you toppled. So in that sense, this issue becomes an important thing, and I think an important psychological marker, which changes the disagreement on the Soviet regime diaspora from very idealistic about what you hear into actually you go and what you see. The Tashnaks go to Armenia and see that it's not as hell as they thought it was. The Ramgabars and Hanchagians go and see that it's far from being the paradise that they expected to see. And so this really becomes a very kind of an interesting thing. This is a picture when my grandpa went with the Armenian football club. He was not, of course, the footballer. He was just the accountant of the team. And when he came back, suddenly asked, what do you think about Armenia? I said, because of all the corruption, etc., the government is actually turning its own population into thieves, he says. He's trying to explain this whole idea of how people were just trying to siphon off from the government to on the private kind of situation. So this is an actual kind of a thing which gradually opens up into a way of trying to understand one another much better and not to be less rigid in your own ideological situation. This is what mainly has changed, I think, the fundamental thing between 1958 and 1975. And based on this, coming is the 1965. And everybody's getting ready for that years in advance. not only in the diaspora, but we now know even in Armenia as well. Soviet leaders actually asked visitors from the diaspora, from memoirs, what are you, sorry, Armenian leaders, what are you planning to do, and things like that. And so gradually, within this context, and I'll talk about more the details of Lebanon later on, it becomes to some extent possible to mark the 50th anniversary of the Armenian genocide together, something which had been almost practically impossible since the breakup in the church issue in the 1950s. Again, it has its limitations. They could not agree on a common political platform, the parties, so essentially they just pushed the religious leadership to take on the front row. And they actually tried to back it. So essentially, religious leaders, the head of the Armenian Orthodox Church, let's say in Lebanon, in Antelias, the Armenian Catholic Patriarchate, again based in Lebanon, and also the leadership of the Armenian evangelical community, they did not essentially put forward a political platform if they call on the people to commemorate the genocide in unison. And that's the limit within which the 50th anniversary is commemorated. We should say that it's not a foregone conclusion that since then everything goes smoothly. This idea that Armenians at least once a year come together, it's a much later phenomenon. It emerged more in the 1980s rather than in the 1960s. So in the coming years, these things continue. But in the meantime, the Tashnak Party gradually starts becoming, in a way, softer and softer towards the Soviet system as well. They first come up with this idea that the Tashnak press would never take a stand in any Cold War issue unless Armenian interests are directly involved. So, for example, in 1956, the Hungarian uprising is celebrated all across the Tashnak press, as some kind of an uprising against Soviet rule. Connections are made with a similar uprising in Armenia in 1921, but when it comes to Prague of 1967, there is not that kind of an enthusiasm, and in that kind of situation. We even now, the party comes and realizes that the party should have two different policies, one against the Soviet government in Yerevan and one against the Kremlin. He stops seeing the Soviet government in Yerevan simply as just following the orders of Kremlin without any kind of self-input. And this is also very much admitted. And we now know that after 1967, direct secret meetings do happen between the government of Armenia and representatives of the Tashnak leaders. Some 12 meetings, I think, between late 1960s and late 1980s, although in the end not much actually is achieved. But in that sense, gradually all these things are happening. Now, the other side is changing as well. It's less enthusiastic about the Soviet Union. You know that it's not as ideal as it thought to be. When they go to Armenia, they see that there are some issues that Armenian people in Armenia want them to raise as well, including the issues of Armenian lands in Soviet Azerbaijan and Soviet Georgia, which they start doing that. Something that they were trying not to talk much about before 1950s. And in the Hunchagian party, these discussions come to a fall in their party congress of 1972, where a certain kind of issue of how close should be to the Soviet system becomes a major issue of contention. And so that's another story in a way. And gradually, a more relatively right-wing leadership of the Tashnak Hunchak party emerges, identified with Harutyun Guzhuni, who was the leader, was thought to be at that time the more right of that in the 1972 conference. And so within this situation is that come 1974, preparations begin for the 60th anniversary. And this time, there is a political platform. It's very vague. It says those lands should be returned to their natural owner, the Armenian people, without specifying whether that should be part of Soviet Armenia or not. So leaving that issue vague. And then comes, that if that happens, that is, if those lands are returned to their natural owner, the Armenian people, in that sense, this is the famous appeal which comes out in September of 1974. Of course, it's published in all languages. This is the English version of it, published in America. In a way, one part of the Armenian question will be solved. The Soviets immediately ask, what is the other part? And they are told that the other part are the Soviet Armenian lands in Georgia and Azerbaijan. So the issue of independence is not the other part. But that, of course, is at the oral level. And so this was the situation. From September of 1974, there was a decision to commemorate the whole issue together, and within that also to come and uh, have it in April of 1975 when the Civil War erupts. Now, within the theoretical kind of situation, where do we put here the Armenian history? I think it falls into that issue of the periodizing of the Cold War, where the dividing line is the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are some historians of the Cold War who say that, and it's old Arne Westad, and it was the one, that essentially from then on, what he calls as identitarian politics, identity politics, becomes much more important. Across the third world, people are not really as enthusiastic about copying the American model or the Soviet model fully, and they start paying more attention to their ethnic differences, etc. And I think that very much fits into the Armenian situation. I've said in the previous work that the Tashnags gradually changed from being a Cold Warrior party into a third worldist party. So these are, of course, definitions that we have to go in. And that leads, again, to borrow something into something like an Armenian détente, similar to détente that was there in the global politics. Except that this détente endures what we call the Second Cold War of the Reagan era of 1979 to 1985, where essentially there is no flare-up among the Armenians, while there is very tense international situation again. How did this happen? I think, again, from the point of political science, Michael Burton's and John Higley's concept of elite settlement is the best thing, in which how leaders on their own come to the conclusion that they have to put an end to this conflict because this conflict is costing too much. While in that situation usually says that that leads to democracy. In the Armenian case, it doesn't lead to democracy, but it led into something which they developed later on in their later articles, saying it led to regime stability. So essentially, a bunch of people come and they say, we are the Armenians. Yeah? Anybody outside us does not have the right to talk about the Armenians. Yeah? And essentially, you see that in Lebanon very, very quickly. If you are outside those three groups, you do not have the right to actually talk about Armenians in Lebanese politics or whatever, etc. It's very much coming from that kind of situation. And again, it has its plus and minuses, but I will only concentrate today because of the topic today that the good side is that Armenians stop killing one another, and Tashnag and Hunchak leaders stop protecting their murderers, yeah, and to make sure that they are not caught by the police, which is one of the most important ways of how you encourage people to kill, because you know that there's a whole party behind you which will protect you, yeah, from the police when you actually do and kill somebody from the other side. So let's come now to the Armenians. Where do the Armenians in Lebanon fit into? Well, again, here comes this idea that does the Armenian diaspora have a capital city? Well, if it has, and how do we decide where it is? Well, probably you have to look where the major institutions have their headquarters and where is the largest amount of cultural production being made at the time. So you can roughly say that the capital city of the Armenian diaspora was Paris in the 1920s, Cairo in the 1930s, and gradually Beirut from the 1950s to late 1970s maybe. And today, if it has a capital, it would be Los Angeles in that sense. Although Los Angeles is probably problematic because it's not in the capital city of a country, which really makes it more difficult than, let's say, Paris or Cairo or Beirut, where you are just next to the government offices of your host country. And in that sense, this is a 1970 cover page of an Armenian newspaper which proclaims Bush Hammoud as the capital of the Armenian diaspora. Although technically we have to be very careful that Bush Hammoud was never the location where the Armenian leadership lived. If we have to talk about a capital, it's probably Zarif and Watwat were the more important place of Armenian diaspora, where all the Armenian upper class of, Ramgavars, Tashnags, AGBU leaders, etc., lived, rather than Bush Hammoud, which is always looked down as the place where, the poor, the less educated, etc., were living. But in any case, it is very important because we're talking about a period where the most of the leadership activity is happening in Beirut. So most of the global pan-diasporic decisions are being taken in Beirut. And the experience in Beirut is actually affecting the thinking, the global thinking of those decision makers, which is, of course, would have been very different, for example, if you live in America. In America, it would not be easy to say, we are neutral in the Cold War unless the Armenian interest is involved. Because if you are a good American, how can you be neutral in the Cold War? But if you are in Lebanon, when Lebanon is part of the non-aligned movement, you can actually, at least on paper, claim that you are neutral during the Cold War issues. And essentially, gradually, all the world headquarters of the Armenian political parties come to Beirut. First the Ramgabars, then the Tashnags, then finally the Hunchags. Most of the world congresses of the parties in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s do happen in Beirut. And so, in a way, everybody is coming to Beirut. And in that kind of situation, Beirut becomes, for a brief period, really the leading position. Something which many Armenian political leaders in Beirut today still look with nostalgia and try to pretend it is. Well, you go out of Beirut, you see that it is no longer. Armenia is a center of, the changes in the Lebanon is no longer the center. And this is also the period of Tashnag ascendancy in Lebanese Armenian situation and politics. Already by the mid-1920s, when the first elections are held in Lebanon for communal bodies, we see that Tashnags have more followers rather than their opponents. And although their candidates lose the elections for the Lebanese parliament in 1929 and 1934 to non-Tashnag candidates, by 1937, already they're very well established. By the way, 1937 elections were a farce in Lebanon. Prior to the election, the French High Commissioner called in Emile Edde and Bashar al-Khouri and decided, you will get so many seats in the next parliament, you will get so many seats. Bashar al-Khouri agreed to a lesser role, and then they came together with unified lists, and of course unified lists won all across the country. Against them were the Arab nationalists who refused the existence of Lebanon as a state, like Riyad al-Sulh in Beirut, for example. And technically, who to take in for that one Armenian seat? Initially, the non-Tashnag candidate was considered favored, but when the Tashnag candidate was able to fill in a much bigger hole, or a much bigger kind of audience in the Armenian refugee camps, etc., they actually switched him. And so they brought in the Tashnag candidate, and it was the first time that the Tashnag party had a representative in the Lebanese parliament. That was in 1937, which really pushed the others, very much like it happens in intercommunal fighting in Lebanon, to go to the other side. And starting from that moment, the non-Tashnags start usually going to the opposition. Yeah, and so they are more to the left, anti-systemic forces, etc., because in a way, the Tashnag party is very comfortable with the pro-government kind of situation, and that continues up until the Hariri era. Yeah? Basically, in a way that all regimes sooner or later make their deal with the Tashnags, even if the Tashnags are late in catching up. So that's a very kind of a trend in that sense. So in 1943-47, the same thing happens in Lebanon. The Tashnags basically are more open. They agree to the election of Karakin I as Catholicos of Antelias, unified, while the seat had been vacant for a number of years. That is seen as a concession by the Tashnag party to the others. But then comes 1947, things change. During that period, the Soviet Union encourages a repatriation of Armenians from the diaspora, and that really becomes a very polarizing event in the diaspora, including in Lebanon. The Tashnags are left out of the organization. Then those Tashnag party members who want to migrate to Armenia are forced to publicly renounce their membership of their parties, etc. And so comes a lot of grudge. In 1947, Cold War begins. Already in 1947 elections, we see the Tashnags actually accusing their opponents of being Bolsheviks, which was not there in the previous 1943 and other elections. And at the end of the year, the Soviet Union recognizes Israel. And that opens the door for a lot of anti-communism in the Arab world, attacks on communist clubs, etc. And that, of course, really gives the Tashnag party a lifeline. And there starts this very strong relationship between the presidential palace, from Kantari to Sarba to Sinilfil and then to Babda, in a way, continuously, yeah, in that sense. And from 1947 to 1972, the Tashnak party wins every single seat it contests in the Lebanese parliament, except one. It loses Bush Hamoud in 1951. Other than that, it doesn't contest, however, the Armenian Catholic seat, which always allows it for Joseph Shader and the Falange. Joseph Shader is always challenged by non-Tashnaks, who always lose. Yeah, but the Tashnaks actually never lay claim to the Armenian Catholic seat until Jacques Choukhadari, yeah, in 1990s, early 1990s. So in that sense, that's a very important kind of a situation. This idea that we are going to work with non-Armenian groups in order to fight pro-Sovietism in Armenian community, that leads into an effort to take control of Armenian communal bodies, which gradually happens, and the crescendo is the election of Zareh I as the Catholicos of Antelias, which the Armenian, well, a large chunk of the Armenian community rejects, but ultimately there is a lot of support by President Shamhoun for that. Actually, in 1980, President Shamhoun writes an article in L'Orient, Le Jour, that his idea was to make Antilles something like a Vatican for the Armenians, so that not only the all Armenians in Lebanon, but also all Armenians in the free world will see Antilles as their God, which was basically the main charge by the non-Tashnaks against the Tashnaks, that this is actually what your political aim is. The Tashnak has always said this is not our own aim, but, well, President Shamon says this was what I was trying to do. So there is a lot of tense situation, and when the civil war erupts, the murders happen because there is nobody to bring anybody to the table together. The church is seen as illegitimate by half the community, so the church cannot play a role. The church is taken side. So you have to wait until the end of the civil war for this to happen. Just to go to some pictures, as soon as the Tashnak candidate wins over the election, there is this idea of extend the jurisdiction of Antilles into various parts of the world. And in a few countries they mentioned that, and including, for example, Khorem Paroyan was the Bishop of Beirut, actually was received by President Richard Nixon, in a way to show that there is American backing for what Antilles and behind the Tashnak party is doing. Actually, he wanted to see President Eisenhower, but they told it was too much. And the American embassy in Lebanon said, we open a Pandora's box if we allow him to have, because so many will stand in line to meet President Eisenhower, so we have to be careful about that. And comes in 1958, and since we're talking about AUB, let's connect it. The only victim was an AUB student among those 3,000 who were killed in Lebanon in 1958 was an Armenian, an engineering student. He was Krikor Agayan. There were three brothers. When they were attacked all together, two of them died. One of them was injured. Towards the very end, I think it was in November of 1958, long before when the city had largely calmed down. So we have to wait until the government of Ford to come in, and finally Raymond Ed as Minister of the Interior to take charge, who actually goes in, brings the Armenian political parties together, makes them sit down, even actually sign an agreement, which is published in the newspaper, signed by the three leaders, etc., that this is something like a ceasefire agreement between them, etc. And so this was the situation. But as I said, gradually things are changing, and in the coming years, the growing links, of course, are playing an important role in calming the situation. In Lebanon, what happens in 1959, a year after the conflict, is very important. Two significant visits happen from Soviet Armenia in October and November, in late October, November, and early December of 1959. First comes in Armenia's major football club, Spartak was called at that time. And it was had moved from the second division to the top division in the Soviet League. But to just show how strong Lebanese football was, they crushed Lebanon's champion Homenmen by a big score. And so they But this is a very important, interesting moment. Maybe if there is, I'll talk more about it. I don't have the time. But even as this happens, us, like the Tashna newspaper, writes an article just before they come. There are rumors that we are going to boycott this. No, these footballers are Armenian footballers, and we will go without any political things to support them. Football is not part of sports, etc., which is it. Even more significantly, the song and dance ensemble comes, and it makes such an impact. State sponsored culture, which Armenians had never seen before from Soviet Union. I think it ends up having so many extra sessions, because the UNESCO hall was packed day in, day out, day in, day out, etc. And this is an actual caricature published in one of the weeklies. Armenia was a no man's land before they come, both sides fighting, shouting at one another. Then the footballer and the dancer come in, and everybody is just now dancing together. Well, things did not end that smoothly. In 1960, a bunch of about a dozen Armenians were again killed for political killings, because in 1960 there were still new elections and lots of competition, etc. But in the end, the cultural ties continue to intensify. Direct flights start between Beirut and Yerevan in 1966. In 1967, the Armenian news agency has a direct link to Beirut, so the next day Armenian newspapers are reporting, etc., and all these things are coming. The Soviet embassy starts posting Armenian diplomats in Lebanon, and for example, this is a visit by the very famous Aram Khachadurian, and actually he is visiting the school, which is a Tashnak school, and here you see the former Prime Minister of independent Armenia on the same table. So it is possible to have some kind of a contact. In 1961, the Soviet government appoints an Armenian, a former leader of the Communist Party, as a possible ambassador of the Soviet Union in Lebanon. The Lebanese government rejects that, because probably that would have been very problematic, having an Armenian-speaking ambassador coming in. And the Soviets also made a concession on the issue of Antillas, and in 1963 they recognized the legality of the next Catholicos, which actually opens the way for the church taking the lead in having the commemoration in Beirut. This is the Cité Sportive, fully packed on the 25th of April 1965, where the Armenians, of course, in close-up pictures, you will see Taqiyuddin Solh and Pierre Schmeyer, all those there as well. Yet again, the Turkish issue becomes an issue to keep the Armenians together. The inauguration of the Big Faya monument in 1970, delayed for months because of what was happening in Beirut, leading to Cairo Accords in 1969. And in 1970, the Turkish government actually sues two Armenian newspapers. And this really brings the community together. This is they trying to build up pressure for that. And this is a picture when they are visiting, among any other, is Musa Sadr, in order to have some kind of defense. In the end, the Turkish side discontinues the trial. The Lebanese judge asks for more documentation. They do not provide that, and so basically the trial actually goes, etc. So this is, in a way, which opens the way for, in the 1975 agreement, in which even the communists are involved to some extent. It was agreed that the communists cannot sign the joint communique, but the Tashnak said we have no problem if the Nchagas and the Ramgabars talk to them, and there is no problem in the lower ranking committees when people are hired on the individual level. Then you can actually have communists work in those communities as well. In 1957, coming now to the Lebanese politics side, from what I've not said, in the 1957 elections, the Armenian Nchagas and Tashnaks really worked together with the opposition that was called the National Front, led by Saib Salam and Abdallah Yafi, basically because they were hoping that if they get elected, they will recognize a second Armenian community so that they will not recognize the legality of the elected Catholicos. But of course, they lost the election. And when Fuad Shihab was elected, two separate Armenian delegations go and actually congratulate him. We now know from American archives that in the end, Shihab vacillates. What should he do? And in the end, under pressure from the deputies, who are all Tashnags, he actually decides to recognize Zareh legality and visits Antilles. But very interestingly, and this is from American source, they call the American embassy from the Babda or from the from Sarbab residence and say, tell your friends, the Catholicos and the Tashnags, to be soft, in the sense that we are recognizing you as legal, but don't make life hard for the other people in a way, when they have to do any kind of dealings. So the Americans, they know that, they're close. This was in 1960. But gradually this changes, and in the Lebanese and Middle Eastern context, the important thing for the Tashnags in the 1950s is this realization that this pro-American policy is having a byproduct which was never their own plan, is that they are now being seen as against the aspirations of Arab leftists and pan-Arab nationalists. That essentially they were being seen. And if we look at the English language literature, Clovis Maqsood, Michael Johnson, etc., there is this kind of praise for the Hunchak position, because essentially that was closer to what the Arab and Arab nationalists did. I think it's a bit exaggerated as well. But in any case, so that really leads into a shift as well in the policy. And I think the key moment which gives a lifeline to the Tashnag party is the very famous speech by Abdel Nasser on the second anniversary of the Suez War, when he attacked communism. That opens the door to the Tashnag to say, well, we told you so. We told you, Arab nationalists, we are with you. Don't trust the communists because we know who the communists are. And now you, Nasser, are saying that the communists should not be trusted. So that really gradually leads up to the Tashnags now go with the Shihab regime. And the Shihab regime's Arab policy is very, very different from the previous Shamoun regime. The election system produces a situation when there is a Falange and Tashnag alliance in Beirut 1, which gives the Tashnags 3 seats in parliament on a regular basis, to the extent in 1961 and 68, the Armenian seats are not even contested by the opponents. They know that they have no chance there. But to use a modern term, it never becomes a political alliance. It remains an electoral alliance. As long as the Falange are okay with Shihab, the Tashnags are okay. When the Falange go against the Shihab regime, the Tashnags remain loyal to the Shihab and the Nash system. The Tashnags do not vote for the electoral ally Pierre Jmeyer when he runs against Charles Helou in the 1965 election. In the Helf system, although they go along with the Helf list in Bush Hammoud, when it comes to the elections of 1970, they vote for Sarkis, and that creates a big problem with the elected Frangieh regime. It takes months for that issue to be actually fixed and sorted out, etc. So, and in the 1972 elections, now becomes a big problem. The Falange and the Tashnags are both getting more and more powerful, but they can only become more powerful at one another's expense, because there's no other way for them to grow. And the serious problem rises in the elections between the Falange and Tashnag on the evangelical seat, whether that should go to an Armenian, that is a pro-Tashnag, or whether it should go to an Arab, which was the case since 1960. And we don't know here whether they did it on their own purpose or whether it was President Shamoun who actually pushed them to do so. In order to strengthen their own position vis-a-vis the Falange, the Tashnag open up their lists for the first time to a couple of half Ramgabar and half Hunchak people. They appoint a candidate for the evangelical seat who is an extremely close friend of the editor-in-chief of the Ramgabar newspaper, thus silencing that newspaper in any way from doing that. They bring in a businessman whose father was a Hunchak, and they offer him a seat, although it's that kind of a deal between the rich person and the party rather than anything ideological. But in that case, they also crush the alliance. So in that sense, that mood also helps for the preparation of the 1974 agreement. When the civil war erupts, you have a group which has had a little bit mild elections in 1972, has worked together for many months toward the 60th anniversary. So it's easy for the same people now to change hats, come in and agree on we're not fighting. So this was a very important kind of a moment. And also the Hunchaks have seen that Arab nationalistic regimes are not perfect as well. And Armenians are not very happy in Iraq. Armenians are not very happy in Syria or whatever. So this kind of commitment to those causes, you also have to really be less enthusiastic than you have to. the whole idea of and this, of course, is a photo in 1958 when Henshak delegations goes up to Mukhtarab, yeah, in order to congratulate Kemal Jumblat at the end of the civil war. This is some kind of an alliance. But yeah, yeah, yeah. Mm. Yeah, yeah. And but come into 1975, things is different. The whole idea of the word positive neutrality, where it comes from, again, I have to say, they say that it comes in from an interview by the Henshag leader with Lorient Le Jour, and that's it. So I will just not stop here because I know I'm out of time. Other issues that I had in mind, if there's time in the Q&A, I'll deal with that. Otherwise, we have to be patient for the book to come out, but that will be a few years away. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sanjian. Before we invite you to a small reception, we have around 10 minutes to get questions, and I insist on questions, not lectures, comments, long comments. So if you have short questions, please feel free.
Definitely, the KGB did infiltrate the Armenian diaspora. The very famous Mitrokhin files has a lot of Armenians in them, like many others. But what is different between the agreement between the CIA and the Tashkent Party is that it was an agreement with the party and the CIA, not as people individually recruited. So that's the CIA has opened some of these agreements, so we have at least the memos of some of the meetings which occurred in the 19. Yeah, but on individualists, of course, yes, there were lots of people who probably worked for the KGB as well, but as individuals rather than as an organization. Look,
Maybe before you answer, maybe we'll get one more question so that.
okay. Your question is one thing which I just skipped because it's not enough to declare neutrality. Yeah, you have to be able to maintain it. Belgium declared neutrality during the two world wars. Nothing happened with declaring neutrality. I think they managed to do it because they were not alone in being neutral in Lebanon. There were other factions who were. Raymond Edde was basically neutral, and he had quite the following. At the very beginning of the civil war, the Amal movement was basically neutral, yeah, at least for the first year or so. So Imam Musa Sadr was really a neutral. So in that sense, they were not alone. That was a very important thing. They said, the leaders, that we also were very careful that so many Arab countries were involved. And if we do some wrong step, yeah, Egyptians, Iraqis, and Syrians, especially those three countries, where you have strong Armenian communities, they also may actually make a lot of problem with their older local Armenian communities as well. So that was also, how was it perceived? I think, except for Bashir Gemayel's period, when there was real anger that the Armenians are not fighting, that the Armenians are not appreciating what they are fighting for. Otherwise, most people got along. Although Armenians had serious problem at one stage with Amal, in the mid 1980s when a number of Armenians were killed by Amal gunmen, in a way. So that was a particular kind of an issue, and also the whole idea of what does neutrality mean is another issue. Where does the Armenian Communist Party fall within this issue of neutrality, etc.? Again, unfortunately, I did not have the time. I didn't talk about Asala because Asala is a post-1975 phenomenon. Um, I don't think anybody was happy with them. Nobody wants a new intruder in the field, claiming support. Yeah, and I think that was the whole issue. I think beyond that, I think there is not that kind of a. Of course, there's a big difference between the Tashnak party, which had its preferred group, yeah, who were doing things similar, yeah, and the Ramgavars and the Hunchaks were basically totally out of that. And if you look at the Asala, I think its members, at least those that we know of, yeah, came from various groups of society. It really brought, people from Anshagian families, from Tashnak families, and etc. So essentially, it was a hodgepodge of young men. Essentially, they were able to survive as long as the Palestinians survived in Lebanon, and after that, there was almost no room for them to be able to continue with what they were trying to do.
One more question.
Everybody's hungry. The whole idea is, I'm not really dead Saad a lot, but the reputation is that he considered the Armenians to be an alien element in Greater Syria, essentially, and so on the theoretical level, there would have, there would be problems. I've heard, I don't know much, that some SNP leaders in the 1990s, when I was writing my PhD, etc., whether to please me or not, they said their Saadi was wrong in the sense that Armenians could come in and become part of the Syrian nation and amalgamate. Again, I'm not. Then it really depends after Saadi is where the SNP found itself in the politics. For example, in 1958, the Tashnas and SNP were friends because they were fighting with Shamon. Yeah. In 1975, so the SNP was on the other side. Yeah. So essentially, there were no Armenians actually fighting on the uh, group led with Shamon, if we just take a few communist members of out. But there were, of course, Armenians in Lebanon within the community who privately were supportive of the reforms proposed by the nationalist movement, in the sense that they would have been okay with, one of the things that Kamal Jumblat wanted as kind of reforms, etc. Especially among the Hunchagian circle, there was a long tradition of respecting Kamal Jumblat as something like an ally. Kamal Jumblat actually did help a lot, including to help the Hunchagians evade justice, whenever there was something. So any Hunchagian who was taught by the police, the first port of call would be Shuf, yeah, because in Shuf he will not be arrested. I have a number of these kind of oral interviews saying, we took him to the Shub, and then from Shub he went to Romania, and from Romania he went there, etc. So that he was that part of that kind of that worker. But so beside that, I think there is not much of a relationship between the SNSP, etc. Electorally, it's only in the Metin area that would really make a big difference, and it really it's more an indirect kind of relationship when those electoral were formed rather than any kind of a direct relationship between them.
Okay, so let's continue this conversation over refreshments and some snacks. So, Professor Sanjian, thank you again for being with us today, and thank you for this fascinating talk. Thank you all for being here.